There's a plantation ledger sitting in the Charleston Historical Society that nobody wants to talk about. It's dated March 1839 and buried in the middle of routine entries about cotton yields and equipment repairs. There's a single line written in different ink, added later, in handwriting that shows the writer's hand was shaking. The incident with the dogs has been resolved. Madame Céline walked from the property this morning. No pursuit will be attempted. May God forgive what we allowed to happen here. The entry isn't signed. The plantation it references, Bel Hombre in the South Carolina Low Country, burned to the ground 6 weeks after that note was written. Every structure reduced to ash, every record destroyed, or almost every record. Because 3 people who were there that spring wrote letters about what they witnessed, and those letters survived in private family collections for over 180 years. What they describe shouldn't be possible. A woman locked in darkness with 7 attack dogs bred specifically to kill, emerging 3 days later not as a corpse, but as something the plantation owner's own son described as a figure of such terrible authority that grown men stepped aside rather than meet her eyes. The dogs followed her, all 7 of them, in perfect formation, like soldiers behind a general. The woman who owned those dogs, the woman who'd ordered the execution, was found dead in her bedchamber that same morning. The doctor wrote apoplexy on the death certificate, but the housemaid who discovered the body told her sister in a letter that Madame's face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, and that every mirror in her room had been shattered from the inside. This is what happens when cruelty becomes so extreme that something breaks in the fabric of how power is supposed to work. Before we go any further into what happened in that locked room beneath Bel Hombre Plantation, I need you to do something right now. If this opening has already gotten under your skin, if you felt that chill when I mentioned the shattered mirrors, hit that subscribe button immediately. Because here at the Sealed Room, we specialize in the stories that American history tried to bury. The ones that reveal truths too disturbing for textbooks. The ones that challenge everything we think we understand about power and survival and the human will. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, what state, what city. I want to know where in America people are ready to face these buried truths. Now let's discover what really happened in that room, and why 3 separate witnesses all described the same impossible thing. The Low Country of South Carolina in 1839 existed as a world of contradictions, breathtaking beauty built on unspeakable brutality. Mansions with columns and crystal chandeliers rising from land soaked in blood and tears. The air itself felt heavy there, thick with moisture that made everything stick, your clothes to your skin, your thoughts to the darkest corners of your mind. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like the grey hair of ghosts, and at night the marshes filled with sounds that could have been birds or could have been the screams of everything that had died there over 2 centuries. Bel Hombre sat 15 miles south of Charleston, accessible only by a single road that turned to impassable mud whenever the rains came hard. The plantation had been in the Duchamp family for 3 generations, built on rice cultivation, that particular form of agricultural hell that killed enslaved people faster than any other crop in the American South. Rice required flooding fields with water, standing in that water for hours, breeding mosquitoes that carried malaria and yellow fever, creating conditions where the death rate among workers exceeded the birth rate every single year. The Duchamps had grown wealthy from this death. Philippe Duchamp, the current master, was rarely at Bel Hombre. He preferred Charleston society, preferred not to see too closely how his comfort was produced. The actual management of the plantation fell to his mother, Madame Marguerite Duchamp, a widow of 60 years who'd been raised in Saint-Domingue before the revolution there, before enslaved people had risen up and taken their freedom in blood and fire. Madame Marguerite had fled that revolution as a girl, had watched her own family's plantation burn, had seen the world she knew destroyed by people she'd been taught were incapable of organized resistance. She'd spent the rest of her life making sure it could never happen to her again. Madame Marguerite was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, always dressed in black even decades after her husband's death. She wore her grey hair pulled back so tightly it gave her a look of permanent surprise, and she carried a small leather crop everywhere she went, not for horses, but for people. She had pale eyes that showed no warmth, no humour, nothing human except a cold intelligence that calculated profit and loss in human suffering. But her real instruments of control weren't whips or chains, or any of the usual tools of her class. Her instruments were 7 dogs. She'd acquired them over the course of 5 years, purchasing them from a breeder in Virginia who specialized in what he called discipline hounds. They were massive animals, each standing over 30 inches at the shoulder, bred from a mix of mastiff, bloodhound, and something else the breeder wouldn't name. Their coats were brindle, dark stripes over tan that made them almost invisible in shadow. Their heads were enormous, their jaws capable of crushing bone. Their eyes held an intelligence that was somehow worse than simple animal aggression. The breeder had trained them using methods he'd learned from plantation owners in Jamaica and Cuba, places where the mathematics of slavery were even more brutal than in the American South. The dogs were conditioned to respond to fear, to identify submission and dominate it, to understand human hierarchy and enforce it. They were never fed adequately, kept always on the edge of starvation to maintain their aggression. They were never shown affection, only commands and punishment. They were taught that certain types of people, people with dark skin, people who worked in fields, people who showed fear, were legitimate targets. Madame Marguerite named them after the 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. She found it amusing, in her cold way, to have the sins of humanity made flesh and fang, obedient only to her voice. The dogs lived in a specially designed kennel behind the main house, a building constructed with double walls and iron gates, with a floor of packed earth covered in straw that was changed weekly. The smell from that building carried across the entire plantation yard, a mixture of animal musk and waste, and something else, something like rage fermenting in darkness. Madame Marguerite's routine with the dogs never varied. Every morning at dawn she would walk to the kennels and command them out. They would follow her in formation, 7 massive shapes moving in perfect synchronization, while she conducted her daily inspection of the plantation. The enslaved people working in the yards or the house would freeze when they heard the dogs approaching, would press themselves against walls or drop their eyes to the ground, making themselves as small and unthreatening as possible. The dogs had killed before. Everyone knew it. A man who'd tried to run in 1836, caught 2 miles from the plantation, brought down by the dogs and held until the overseer arrived. He'd survived, but his leg hadn't. A woman who'd fought back when the overseer tried to assault her, the dogs released as punishment, stopping just short of killing, but leaving scars that covered half her body. The message was clear and constantly reinforced. Resistance meant the dogs, disobedience meant the dogs. Any crack in submission meant the dogs. Into this environment of carefully calibrated terror, Madame Marguerite purchased a woman in the winter of 1838. The sale happened at the Charleston market on a cold February morning. The woman was part of an estate liquidation from a failed plantation in North Carolina. She was listed in the auction catalogue as female, approximately 25 years, house-trained, literate, a defect, history of insubordination, price reduced accordingly. The listing noted that she'd been sold 3 times in the past 5 years, each time for less money, each time with the same notation about her temperament. Madame Marguerite paid $400, well below market value. She wasn't bothered by the warnings about insubordination. In fact, she preferred it. Breaking someone who'd already been broken held no interest for her. Breaking someone who still thought they had will, who still held some core of self that was satisfying. The woman received the name Céline at Bel-Ombre, not because it had been her name before, but because Madame Marguerite had once known a Creole servant by that name in Saint-Domingue, and the association amused her. Céline stood perhaps 5'6", tall for women of that era, with a slender build that came from a lifetime of insufficient food rather than natural frame. Her hands showed the calluses and scars of both fieldwork and domestic labor. Her face held sharp features, high cheekbones, eyes that were described in the auction papers as disconcertingly direct. She moved with a particular kind of careful grace, the movement of someone who'd learned to take up minimal space, to pass through the world, causing the least disruption possible. But there was something else about her, something that made overseers uncomfortable, something that had gotten her sold repeatedly despite her skills. She didn't break eye contact quickly enough. She didn't show fear the way she was supposed to. When given orders, she obeyed them, but there was a quality in her obedience that suggested choice rather than submission, as if she'd decided to comply rather than being forced to. This quality, this tiny retention of agency, was exactly what Madame Marguerite had been looking for. Céline's first weeks at Bel Ombre followed a familiar pattern. She was assigned to housework, cleaning rooms, serving meals, attending to the daily maintenance of a large household. Madame Marguerite watched her constantly during this period, looking for mistakes, for any opportunity to establish dominance, to begin the process of breaking that will. The mistakes came because Madame Marguerite ensured they came. Instructions deliberately unclear, tasks impossible to complete in the time given, items planted in Céline's quarters, then discovered missing from the house. Each mistake brought punishment. Whipping, withholding of food, hours locked in a closet, the standard tools of degradation and control. Céline endured. She bent, but something in her refused to break entirely. Madame Marguerite could see it in her eyes, still watching, still calculating, still containing some spark that wouldn't extinguish. It became an obsession. By summer of 1838, the household staff had learned to avoid Céline, understanding that proximity to Madame's fixation meant danger. The overseer, a man named Garrett who'd worked at Bel Ombre for 15 years, began making quiet predictions about how long the woman would last. 6 months, he told the other staff. Maybe less. Nobody survives being the Madame's special project. But Céline survived through summer, through fall, through winter. Each punishment left marks on her body, but not on whatever core of self she protected. And with each failed attempt to break her, Madame Marguerite's obsession deepened, her methods became more extreme, her anger at this impossible resistance grew colder and more calculated. Then came March of 1839, and the incident with the silver candlesticks. March 14th, 1839, started like every other day at Bel Ombre. Céline rose before dawn in the small room she shared with 2 other house servants, dressed in the dark, and began her morning duties. The main house stood silent except for the settling sounds of old wood and the distant calls of marsh birds greeting the sun. Madame Marguerite rarely appeared before 9, which gave the household staff a few precious hours of relative peace. Céline moved through her tasks with the practiced efficiency she developed over a year at Bel Ombre. Empty chamber pots, lay fires in the downstairs rooms, polish the silver service in the dining room, sweep the entrance hall. Each task completed in silence, her mind deliberately blank, focused only on the immediate action, never allowing herself to think beyond the next hour, the next task, the next moment of survival. At 8 o'clock, while she was polishing the candlesticks in the dining room, she heard Madame Marguerite's bedroom door open upstairs. Footsteps crossed the upper hallway, sharp and quick, earlier than usual. The footsteps descended the stairs with unusual speed. Madame Marguerite appeared in the dining room doorway, still in her dressing gown, her grey hair unpinned and hanging loose around her shoulders, her face carrying an expression that Céline had learned meant immediate danger. "Where are they?" Céline set down the candlestick she'd been polishing and stood, her eyes dropping to the floor, as protocol demanded. "Ma'am, my grandmother's candlesticks, the pair from Saint-Domingue, sterling silver with the Duchamp crest. They were on the mantel in my sitting room yesterday evening. This morning, they're gone." Madame Marguerite moved into the room, circling Céline slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. "You cleaned my sitting room yesterday afternoon." "Yes, ma'am." "You were alone in there for how long?" "Perhaps 20 minutes, ma'am." "Dusting and sweeping." "And you saw the candlesticks?" Céline hesitated. This was a trap. Whatever answer she gave would be wrong. If she said yes, she'd be accused of noticing valuable items. If she said no, she'd be accused of lying or incompetence. "I saw them on the mantel, ma'am. I dusted around them." "But you didn't take them?" "No, ma'am." Madame Marguerite completed her circle, standing now between Céline and the doorway. "Empty your pockets." Céline did, turning out the pockets of her apron to show they contained nothing but a cleaning rag and a small piece of soap. "Your quarters, then. We'll search your quarters." The search took minutes. The room Céline shared with 2 other women contained almost nothing beyond sleeping pallets and a few changes of clothes. The candlesticks weren't there. Neither was anything else of value. Madame Marguerite stood in the doorway, her jaw working, her hands opening and closing at her sides. Her pale eyes had taken on a quality Céline recognized, a look that meant rational thought had been replaced by something colder, something that calculated cruelty for its own sake. "You hid them somewhere else. You gave them to someone to sell. You thought you could steal from me and I wouldn't notice." "Ma'am, I didn't take anything. I would never." The slap came so fast Céline didn't see it coming. Madame Marguerite's small hand caught her across the mouth, the silver rings she wore cutting into Céline's lip. "Don't speak. Don't you dare speak unless I tell you to." Céline tasted blood. She kept her eyes down, her body still, waiting. Madame Marguerite stood silent for a long moment, her breathing audible in the small room. Then her expression changed, shifting from rage to something worse, something that resembled satisfaction. "Garrett," she called, her voice carrying through the house. The overseer appeared within seconds, a tall man with thinning red hair and skin permanently damaged by sun. He carried a whip coiled at his belt, more as symbol than tool, but everyone knew he could use it. "Take her to the room, the one beneath the kennels." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly. "The dog room, ma'am?" "Yes." "For how long?" Madame Marguerite smiled, an expression that never reached her eyes. "Until I decide she's learned proper respect for other people's property. 3 days. No food, water once daily. Let her sit in the dark and think about the consequences of theft." "Yes, ma'am." "Should I?" "No whipping. Not yet. I want her whole and thinking clearly. I want her to understand that what comes next is entirely her fault." They took Céline across the yard toward the kennel building. The morning had warmed into typical low-country humidity, the kind that made breathing feel like work. The dogs started barking as soon as they saw movement, a thunderous sound that echoed across the plantation. The massive animals threw themselves against their gates, their bodies creating impacts that shook the wooden structure. The room beneath the kennels had been built for a specific purpose: punishment, isolation, terror. It was accessed through a trapdoor in the floor of the main kennel building, the opening hidden beneath a section of removable boards. Garrett lifted the boards and unlocked the iron padlock securing the door. "Down." Céline looked into the opening. A wooden ladder descended into complete darkness. The smell rising from below was earth and old wood and animal waste from the kennels above, concentrated and sour. She climbed down. The ladder went down approximately 12 feet, depositing her in darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hands. As her eyes adjusted, minimal light bleeding through cracks in the floorboards above revealed a space perhaps 10 feet square, maybe 8 feet tall at the center where the ceiling peaked. The floor was packed earth, cool and slightly damp. The walls were rough cypress boards fitted tightly enough that almost no light penetrated from outside. A wooden bucket sat in one corner. A single blanket, threadbare and stiff with old stains, lay folded against one wall. Nothing else occupied the space. The trapdoor slammed shut above. The padlock clicked. Garrett's boots walked away across the floor. The dogs continued barking for several minutes, then gradually quieted. Céline sat with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around her legs. Her lip still bled slightly from where Madame Marguerite had struck her. She could hear the dogs above, their breathing, their occasional movements, the scrape of claws on wood. 3 days. She could survive 3 days. She'd survived worse in North Carolina, locked in a smokehouse for 4 days after talking back to an overseer. This room was bigger than the smokehouse, and at least it wasn't summer heat that could kill you just from breathing. What Céline didn't know, couldn't know, was that Madame Marguerite had no intention of letting her out after 3 days. The first day passed in a strange, suspended time. Garrett brought water at sunset, lowering a cup on a string through a gap in the floorboards without speaking, waiting while Céline drank, then pulling the cup back up. The dogs learned to ignore the presence below them, settling into their routines. Céline dozed when she could, her body adapting to the hard ground, her mind deliberately empty. She'd learned this survival technique years ago. Don't think about time. Don't think about what comes next. Exist only in the immediate moment. Breathe, listen, survive. The second day brought real hunger. Not just the usual background ache of insufficient food, but a gnawing emptiness that made her stomach cramp. The darkness began to feel heavier. Time became impossible to judge. She counted Garrett's water delivery, marking 12 hours, but the time between stretched and compressed unpredictably. On the third day, Garrett didn't come. Céline waited, listening for his footsteps, hearing nothing but the dogs. Her mouth felt dry as sand. The hunger had evolved beyond discomfort into something that commanded all her attention, made her thoughts slow and thick. She called out once, "Garrett, I need water." No response. The day passed. No water came. That night, the third night of her confinement, she heard different footsteps above. Lighter, quicker, the rustle of skirts. "Céline." Madame Marguerite's voice came through the floorboards, sweet and mocking. "Are you thirsty? Are you hungry? Are you ready to confess?" Céline didn't respond. Her throat felt too dry for speech. "I found the candlesticks this morning. They'd fallen behind a cabinet in my sitting room, exactly where I must have knocked them days ago. So you were innocent all along. Isn't that interesting?" A pause filled with the sound of the dogs stirring. "But you're still down there, aren't you? Because this was never about the candlesticks. This is about that thing you do, that look in your eyes, that tiny piece of yourself you've kept despite everything I've done, that spark that refuses to die. I'm going to extinguish it, Céline. I'm going to leave you down there until there's nothing left but empty submission." The footsteps moved to different positions above, pacing. "I've decided on an experiment, a test of survival and natural order. The dogs above you haven't been fed in 4 days. They're starving, desperate, reduced to pure animal need. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to open that door and send them down to you, all 7 of them, and nature will take its course. The strong will consume the weak. The well-bred will destroy the defiant. There's a perfection to it, don't you think?" Céline pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering. "Or," Madame Marguerite continued, her voice still carrying that terrible sweetness, "you can save yourself. You can scream and beg. You can promise me the absolute broken submission I've been trying to achieve since you arrived. You can sob and plead and offer me everything I require. You have until dawn. After that, the choice won't be yours." The footsteps walked away. A door closed. The dogs above settled into restless silence, occasionally whining, their hunger making them agitated. Céline sat in darkness, her mind racing. 7 starving dogs, a space too small to run. No weapons, no defense, no way to fight or escape. Unless an idea began forming, built from fragments of observation, from a year of watching Madame Marguerite with her dogs, from childhood memories of animals and their hierarchies, from desperate understanding that her only chance lay in attempting something impossible. The dogs weren't pets. They were tools, trained to respond to dominance and fear, conditioned to understand hierarchy. Their entire existence was built around recognizing who held power. What if that hierarchy could be challenged? What if hunger had weakened not just Céline, but the dog's conditioning as well? What if the thing Madame Marguerite had been trying to break, that core of will, was exactly what could save her? Céline spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing. She used her fingers to dig in the packed earth floor, creating small depressions in different corners. She tore strips from her blanket, wrapping them around her hands and forearms as makeshift protection. She positioned herself in the center of the room, away from walls, where she'd have space to move. Most importantly, she made a decision. When those dogs came down, she wouldn't scream, wouldn't run, wouldn't show fear. She would meet them as an equal, as another predator, as something that refused to be prey. It was insane. It was her only chance. Dawn light began showing through the cracks above. Céline heard Madame Marguerite arrive, heard Garrett with her, heard the gates of the dog runs being opened one by one. The animals began to move, their claws clicking on wood, their breathing heavy with anticipation. The padlock clicked. The trapdoor lifted. The first dog down was Pride, the largest of the 7, 140 pounds of muscle and hunger. His brindle coat seemed to absorb what little light existed in the cellar. His eyes adjusted quickly to the dimness, finding Céline immediately, his body tensing like a coiled spring. 4 days without food had stripped away every layer of training that conflicted with survival. He was, in that moment, purely animal, purely predator, and Céline smelled like food. Céline didn't move. She stood in the center of the cellar, her feet planted shoulder-width apart, her wrapped hands loose at her sides, her eyes locked on the dog's eyes. Not staring, which would signal challenge and trigger attack. Watching, acknowledging, communicating awareness. Pride circled left. Céline turned with him, maintaining eye contact, keeping her body oriented to face him directly. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she controlled her breathing, kept it steady and deep. The second dog came down. Wrath. Faster and more aggressive than Pride, his lips already pulled back from yellowed teeth, then greed, then envy. Within 2 minutes, all 7 dogs stood in the cellar with Céline, their combined mass filling the small space, their breathing loud and harsh in the enclosed air. The trapdoor remained open above. Morning sunlight spilled down, creating a shaft of light that illuminated the scene below. "She's not even screaming," Céline heard Garrett say, his voice carrying genuine confusion. "She will," Madame Marguerite replied. "Animals know when they're about to die. Give them a moment." But Céline wasn't screaming. She was watching the dogs establish their formation, determining hierarchy, deciding which animal would lead the attack. Pride remained in front, but Wrath and Greed were moving to flank positions, cutting off escape routes that didn't exist anyway in the confined space. Céline did something then that would seem incomprehensible to anyone watching from above. She stepped forward, directly toward Pride. The dog froze. This wasn't prey behavior. Prey ran, cowered, showed submission through body language and fear scent. This was something else, something that triggered different instincts, created confusion in simple predator calculations. Céline took another step, closing the distance to perhaps 5 feet. She could smell the dog now, unwashed fur and desperation and the sour stench of starvation. She could see the individual muscles tensing in his shoulders, the calculation happening behind those dark eyes. Then she did something stranger still. She dropped to one knee, lowering herself to the dog's level, making herself smaller, reducing the physical dominance of height. But she kept her eyes level with his, kept her body oriented forward, kept something in her posture that communicated not submission but equality. Recognition between 2 creatures caught in the same trap. She extended one wrapped hand, not as offering or threat, as acknowledgement. Pride's massive head tilted slightly. Confused, the other dogs had stopped moving, watching their leader, waiting for the signal to attack. The cellar held absolutely still except for breathing. 7 dogs and 1 woman, all hungry, all desperate, all caught in a moment that could break toward violence or something else entirely. Céline spoke. Her voice came out rough from days without adequate water, barely above a whisper, but steady. You're hungry. I'm hungry. We're all hungry. She made us this way. Madame Marguerite laughed from above, the sound sharp and cruel. She's lost her mind. The fear has broken her sanity, but Céline continued. Her words not for Madame Marguerite, but for the dogs, for herself, for whatever instinct or intelligence might exist in the space between species, where suffering becomes a shared language. You've been starved and beaten and made into weapons. You know what it means to be someone's tool. You know what it feels like when she looks at you like you're nothing but an instrument of her will. She shifted her position slightly, still kneeling, moving with slow deliberation toward one of the depressions she'd dug in the earth. The dogs watched, but didn't attack. Pride took a step forward, sniffing, his aggression shifting toward curiosity. Céline reached the depression and began digging deeper with her wrapped hands, pulling up earth, creating a hole. The dogs came closer, intrigued by the activity, their predatory focus disrupted by this strange behavior. She could feel them surrounding her now, their breath on her back and neck, their massive presence overwhelming. Any one of them could kill her in seconds. 7 of them, starving and trained to dominate, should have already torn her apart. But something in the dynamic had shifted. Some calculation in their simple minds was being rewritten by this behavior that didn't match any pattern they'd been taught. Céline pulled something from the hole. A rat, not a large one, maybe 6 ounces. She'd found it dead on her second night in the cellar, killed by poison or trap. She'd hidden it, knowing it was pathetically inadequate as any kind of defense, but too desperate to discard any potential resource. Now she held it up, 7 pairs of eyes, fixed on the rat with laser focus. Céline tore the rat into pieces with her hands, the action brutal and pragmatic. She threw the largest piece to the far corner. 4 dogs immediately rushed toward it, a brief scuffle before Pride asserted dominance and claimed the prize, swallowing it whole in one gulp. She threw the second piece to the opposite corner. Wrath and greed competed for it, wrath emerging victorious. She divided the remaining pieces, throwing them to different corners, ensuring each dog got something, however small. The entire exchange took maybe 30 seconds. When it was over, all 7 dogs turned back to Céline, still hungry, but now with a new association forming. This creature had addressed their hunger. This creature had provided, however inadequately. This creature might provide again. That won't save you, Madame Marguerite called down, but her voice carried less certainty than before. 1 rat among 8 mouths. All you've done is give them a taste of meat. Now they'll want more. But something fundamental had changed in the cellar. Céline sat down slowly, her back against the wall, her body deliberately relaxed, despite her hammering heart. The dogs approached, sniffing her aggressively, their wet noses pushing against her arms, her legs, her face, investigating every inch of her. She didn't flinch, didn't resist. Let them learn her scent without the overlay of fear. Let them reach their own conclusions about whether she was food or something else. Pride pushed his massive head against her chest, nearly knocking her backward. She steadied herself and, moving very slowly, brought one wrapped hand up to the side of his neck. Not petting, which would be presumptuous, just touching, acknowledging his presence, his reality as a living creature rather than a weapon. The dog's tail, which had been rigid, gave a single uncertain wag. His ears, which had been pinned back, relaxed slightly forward. The other dogs, seeing their leader's response, crowded closer. Not attacking, just close, seeking something they'd never been offered before. Contact without pain, presence without punishment. Céline sat surrounded by 7 starving animals, each one capable of killing her instantly, each one conditioned by Madame Marguerite to dominate through intimidation and violence. But they weren't attacking, they were confused, uncertain, responding to something in Celine's bearing that didn't match their training, that didn't fit any category they'd been taught to recognize. "This is impossible." Garrett's voice drifted down from above. "They should have torn her apart by now. I've seen these dogs attack men twice her size for less provocation than being locked in a room with them." "Give them time," Madame Marguerite said, but everyone listening could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. The hours that followed would later be described by Garrett in a letter to his brother as contrary to every natural law and principle of animal behavior I have witnessed in 20 years managing hounds and people. The dogs didn't attack. They settled around Celine in the cellar, their bodies pressed against hers for warmth, their hunger not forgotten but subordinated to pack dynamics that were rewriting themselves in real time. Celine spoke to them throughout the morning, her voice steady despite her own desperate thirst and hunger, her words meaningless in content but crucial in tone. She wasn't trying to command them. She was simply present with them. Fellow prisoner, fellow survivor, fellow creature trapped by the same cruelty. The dogs, bred and trained to respond to dominance and fear, found themselves responding instead to something they'd never encountered before. Solidarity. Madame Marguerite watched for hours, her face visible in the opening above, showing increasing frustration and something approaching genuine bewilderment. She called down commands in sharp French, words that should have triggered the dogs' training. They ignored her. She threw food down at midday, dried meat that should have caused a feeding frenzy among starving animals. The dogs ate in an almost orderly fashion, and Pride, the pack leader, brought a piece to Celine, dropping it at her feet. "How is she doing this?" Madame Marguerite's voice had lost its mocking quality, replaced by something that might have been fear. "Garrett, how is this possible?" Garrett had no answer. Neither did any of the household staff who'd gathered to watch, drawn by rumors of something impossible occurring in the kennels. As afternoon progressed into evening, Celine began moving around the cellar in slow, deliberate patterns. Testing, the dogs moved with her, following her movements, their formation shifting from predatory to protective. When she approached the ladder, they positioned themselves behind her. When she sat, they formed a circle around her. Their loyalty to Madame Marguerite, built through years of conditioning and fear, was dissolving under the reality of shared imprisonment and hunger, under the experience of being treated as living creatures rather than weapons. By evening of that first day together, the dynamic had completely inverted from what Madame Marguerite intended. The dogs weren't threatening Celine. They were protecting her. Madame Marguerite, faced with the humiliation of having her control challenged, having her perfect instruments of terror choosing solidarity with her intended victim, made a decision that would prove fatal. She ordered Garrett to descend into the cellar and retrieve Celine by force, to separate her from the dogs, to reassert the proper order of things. Garrett, to his credit, recognized the insanity of this order. "Ma'am, those dogs will attack anyone who approaches her now. They've bonded to her somehow. I don't understand it, but I understand that going down there would be suicide. Then, bring the dogs up. Bring them up separately, and they won't come without her. Look at them." And it was true. When Garrett called the dogs from above, using the French commands they'd been trained to obey since they were puppies, not one of them moved. They stayed with Celine, their eyes fixed on her, their bodies positioned between her and any potential threat from above. Madame Marguerite's face went through a progression of expressions visible even in the dimming light: confusion, anger, disbelief, and finally, something darker, something that resembled hatred so pure it bordered on madness. This slave, this property she'd purchased to break and dominate, had accomplished what Madame Marguerite herself couldn't achieve. Absolute loyalty from creatures bred to know only fear and violence. "Fine," Madame Marguerite said finally, her voice cold and flat. We'll wait until she's too weak to maintain whatever spell she's cast. We'll wait until hunger breaks this obscene alliance. We'll wait until nature reasserts itself and they remember what they are." She closed the trapdoor. The padlock clicked. In the darkness below, Céline sat with 7 dogs pressed against her, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing the experience of being Madame Marguerite's instruments of cruelty turned against their purpose. Céline knew Madame Marguerite would bring no more food, no more water. The plan was to starve them all, to force the dogs to choose between loyalty and survival. She had bought herself time, had created an impossible alliance, but unless something changed, they would all die in this cellar. The question became, how long could survival instinct be held at bay by pack loyalty? How long before hunger overrode whatever bond Céline had created? The answer was 4 more days. 4 days during which Madame Marguerite waited for screams that never came. 4 days during which Garrett reported only silence from below, occasional movement, dogs that should have been maddened by starvation but seemed instead to be conserving energy, lying together in the darkness. 4 days during which Madame Marguerite's certainty began to crack, her sleep became impossible, her grip on the reality she'd constructed began to slip. On the morning of the 8th day, March 22nd, 1839, Madame Marguerite made her final mistake. The decision to open the trapdoor on the 8th morning came not from strategy, but from something breaking inside Madame Marguerite's mind. She hadn't slept in 4 days. The household staff whispered about it, exchanged worried glances when she appeared at odd hours, still dressed in the same clothes from the previous day, her grey hair coming loose from its tight arrangement, her pale eyes showing a wildness that hadn't been there before. She'd taken to standing over the trapdoor for hours at a time, listening, pressing her ear to the floorboards, demanding that Garrett tell her what he heard. His reports never satisfied her. Movement, breathing, the occasional bark or whine, but no violence, no feeding frenzy, no sounds of her will being enacted. The silence from below tortured her more than screams would have. Screams she could understand. Screams meant pain, meant dominance, meant the natural order asserting itself. But this silence, this impossible continuation of life where death should have occurred, undermined everything she believed about power and hierarchy and control. The household staff had begun whispering, not loudly, not openly, but in the spaces between duties and in the corners of rooms where Madame Marguerite couldn't hear. The woman in the cellar had survived 8 days with 7 starving dogs. The woman, who should have been torn apart in minutes, had somehow created an alliance that defied every principle of nature anyone understood, and Madame Marguerite couldn't tolerate it. Not the survival itself, which was disturbing enough, but what it meant, that her judgment had been wrong, that her power had limits. That someone she considered beneath consideration had found strength Madame Marguerite couldn't comprehend or control. On the morning of March 22nd, she ordered Garrett to assemble every able-bodied man on the plantation, 8 field workers, 3 house servants, the stable hand, 12 men total, armed with axes and long poles and whatever makeshift weapons could be gathered. She would open the trap door, she announced, and the men would go down together. They would separate the woman from the dogs using overwhelming force. The animals would be destroyed, all 7 of them. And Céline would be brought up and punished in ways that would serve as an example to every enslaved person in the Low Country. Garrett tried one final time to dissuade her. "Ma'am, those dogs have been without adequate food for 12 days. If we go down there, if we agitate them, there's no predicting what will happen. They may attack us. They may attack each other. And the woman, ma'am, she's been down there just as long. She may already be dead. Then we'll retrieve a corpse and bury it where no one will find it," Madame Marguerite snapped. "And we'll burn this kennel to the ground and never speak of this again. But we're opening that door. Now. Today. I will not spend another hour with this defiance mocking me from beneath my feet." The men gathered in the kennel building at dawn. The morning air carried the thickness of an approaching storm, the kind of heavy humidity that made breathing difficult and tempers short. Madame Marguerite stood beside the trapdoor dressed in black, her hands trembling slightly, her face showing the exhaustion and obsession of her sleepless nights. "Open it," she commanded. Garrett unlocked the padlock and lifted the trapdoor. The smell that rose from below made several men step back, covering their noses. Stale air, human and animal waste, the concentrated scent of bodies in close confinement. But underneath those expected smells was something else, something none of them could identify. Not death, not decay, something almost like calm. Light spilled down into the cellar, illuminating a scene that made no sense to anyone watching. Céline sat in the center of the space, her back straight despite obvious weakness, her clothes filthy and torn, her face gaunt from days without adequate food or water. But her eyes were clear, alert, focused. The 7 dogs lay around her in a perfect circle, their bodies touching hers and each other's, creating a living barrier. All 14 eyes, human and canine, looked up at the opening above, with identical expressions. Not fear, not submission. Defiance. Céline. Madame Marguerite's voice came out strangled, lacking its usual cold authority. It's time to come up. This experiment is over. Come up now and we'll discuss your future. Céline didn't respond, didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on Madame Marguerite's face with an intensity that made the older woman take an involuntary step backward. I said, come up. That's an order. I own you. I own your life. You will obey me. Céline spoke then, her voice rough from disuse but carrying clearly in the silent building. No. The single word hung in the air like a gunshot. Madame Marguerite's face went from white to red. What did you say? No. I'm not coming up alone. We're coming up together, all 8 of us, or we're staying down here. You don't give orders anymore. Not to me. Not to them. It was the most direct defiance Madame Marguerite had faced in her entire life. She'd built her existence on absolute certainty of her superiority, her control, her right to command. Now a slave was refusing her orders and claiming authority over her dogs. Garrett, send the men down, drag her up. But before anyone could move, the dogs stood as one. Their movements synchronized, their bodies positioning between the ladder and Céline with precision that looked rehearsed, though it couldn't possibly be. Pride stepped forward, his massive head lowering, his lips pulling back to show teeth in a snarl that communicated absolute commitment to violence. Behind him, the other 6 dogs arranged themselves in a formation that left no gaps, no vulnerabilities, no way to reach Céline without going through them. The first man to put his foot on the ladder, a field hand named Samuel who'd worked with dogs his entire life, took one look at Pride's expression and stepped back. I'm not going down there, madame. That dog will kill anyone who tries. Then we'll shoot them. All of them. Someone get rifles. Ma'am, Garrett said quietly. If we start shooting in that confined space, we'll hit the woman, and if we hit the dogs without killing them immediately, they'll attack whoever's on that ladder. This situation it's beyond force now. Madame Marguerite whirled on him, her face contorted with rage and something that might have been the first hint of genuine fear. Are you defying me too? Are you joining the mutiny? I'm observing that your strategy isn't working. It hasn't worked for 8 days. And continuing down this path will only end in bloodshed that serves no purpose. Then what do you suggest? What would you do? Garrett looked down into the cellar at the woman and the dogs, at the impossible alliance that had formed in darkness and desperation. He was not a kind man. His profession had required cruelty. But he was pragmatic, and he recognized when a situation had moved beyond his understanding. I'd let her up, ma'am. Let her up with the dogs. See what happens in open space. See if this bond holds outside that cellar. Absolutely not. That would be surrendering. With respect, ma'am, surrender has already occurred. The question is whether we acknowledge it or let it escalate into something worse. Madame Marguerite stood frozen, her entire worldview crashing against the reality of the scene below her. Then Céline spoke again from the darkness, her voice stronger now, carrying an authority that seemed impossible from someone in her position. I'm coming up. The dogs are coming with me. You can close that door and keep us locked down here until we all die, which won't take much longer, or you can step back and let us out. Either way, You've already lost. How dare you? You are property. You have no rights, no authority, no— You wanted to break me, Céline interrupted, her voice cutting through Madame Marguerite's words like a blade. You wanted to extinguish whatever you saw in my eyes that offended you. You tried every punishment you could imagine. And when that failed, you tried to have me killed in the most horrific way you could devise. But I'm still here. I'm still myself. And these dogs know what you are now just as clearly as I do. Madame Marguerite's hand moved to the pistol at Garrett's belt, pulling it before he could react. She pointed it down into the cellar, her hand shaking. I could end this. One bullet and this obscenity ends. You could, Céline said calmly. But then you'd have 7 starving dogs with no reason left to restrain themselves in a cellar with only one exit. And that exit leads through 12 men who are already terrified. Pull that trigger and see what happens next. It was a bluff. Or maybe it wasn't. The dogs certainly looked ready to respond to violence with violence. Their bodies coiled with tension, their eyes fixed on Madame Marguerite with an intensity that made several men step further back from the opening. Madame Marguerite's hand shook harder. Her finger touched the trigger. The moment stretched taut, ready to snap toward bloodshed. Garrett stepped forward and put his hand on Madame Marguerite's arm, gently but firmly lowering the pistol. Ma'am, please, let her up. Something in his voice, a combination of pleading and command, seemed to penetrate Madame Marguerite's rage. She lowered the pistol, stepped back from the opening. Fine, she whispered. Let her up. Let them all up. Let's see how long this unnatural alliance lasts outside that hole. Céline began climbing the ladder slowly, her movements careful, her body obviously weakened by the ordeal. As she climbed, the dogs began climbing behind her, using the ladder with surprising agility for their size. They didn't rush, didn't crowd. They ascended in order, Pride first, then the others in a sequence that seemed predetermined. Céline emerged into the kennel building, standing in morning light for the first time in 8 days. She looked like a ghost, her clothes hanging loose, her skin pale where it wasn't covered in dirt, her hair wild and matted. But her eyes held steady and clear. And when she looked at Madame Marguerite, it was with something that transcended hatred or fear. Pity. She stepped away from the trapdoor. The dogs emerged behind her, forming immediately into that same protective circle. The assembled men had backed up against the walls, giving space, their eyes wide. Madame Marguerite stood frozen, the pistol still hanging at her side. She stared at Céline with an expression that mixed hatred and disbelief, and something that looked like madness taking final root. "What are you?" she whispered. "I'm exactly what you tried to destroy," Céline said quietly. "I'm someone who refuses to break. You bought me because I was cheap, because someone in North Carolina thought defiance made me worthless. You tried to break me with work and whipping and starvation and humiliation. When that failed, you tried to have me killed, but I'm still here. I'm still whole. And now these dogs understand something you never could." "What? What could they possibly understand? That cruelty isn't strength. That fear isn't loyalty. That we are all just tools to you. They spent years learning to fear you, to submit to you. Then they spent 8 days in that cellar with someone who treated them like fellow prisoners instead of weapons. And they made their choice." Madame Marguerite laughed, a sound without humor. "You think this changes anything? You're still a slave, they're still dogs, and I'm still the law on this property." "No," Céline said simply. "You're not. Everyone here has seen what happened. Everyone knows you tried to have me killed and failed. Everyone knows your authority over your own animals has been broken. How long before every person you claim to own realizes your power isn't absolute?" Madame Marguerite's face went through a series of expressions before settling on cold fury. "Garrett, take her. Now. Use whatever force is necessary." But Garrett didn't move. Neither did any of the other men. They looked at Céline, at the dogs around her, at the impossible scene, and they recognized that something fundamental had shifted. "This is mutiny," Madame Marguerite said, her voice rising toward hysteria. This is insurrection. I'll have you all prosecuted. I'll have you all." She never finished the sentence. Céline took a step forward. The dogs moved with her, and Madame Marguerite stepped back, retreating from a slave and 7 dogs she'd once controlled absolutely. That single step backward communicated everything: the acknowledgement of fear, the concession that the dynamic had changed irrevocably. Céline walked toward the door of the kennel building. The dogs followed. The assembled men parted to let them pass, pressing themselves against the walls. At the doorway, Céline paused and looked back. "I'm leaving. I'm walking off this plantation, and these dogs are coming with me. You can try to stop me, or you can let me go. Either way, everyone here will know what happened in that cellar. You won't make it 10 miles, Madame Marguerite said, her voice shaking. They'll catch you. They'll bring you back in chains, and when they do, I'll make everything you've experienced seem like mercy." "Maybe," Céline said, "but I'd rather die free than live as your property." She walked out into the morning. The 7 dogs followed in formation, their bodies surrounding hers, their eyes scanning for threats. Madame Marguerite stood paralyzed, watching through the doorway as Céline crossed the yard, past the main house, and headed toward the road that led away from Bel Ombre. Then Madame Marguerite screamed, a sound of pure rage and frustration that echoed across the plantation, bringing field workers running from every direction. They arrived to see Céline walking steadily toward the road, dogs surrounding her, and Madame Marguerite standing in the kennel doorway, her face contorted with something beyond anger, beyond reason. "Stop her!" Madame Marguerite shrieked. "Someone stop her!" But no one moved. They all stood frozen, watching something they couldn't quite believe, watching the impossible made real. Céline walked down the long drive toward the road. The dogs maintained formation around her, and every person on Bel Ombre plantation watched in silence as they disappeared from sight around a bend in the trees. Madame Marguerite turned and walked toward the main house, her movements stiff and mechanical, her face showing nothing now, all expression wiped away, replaced by terrible blankness. What happened in the house over the following hours would be pieced together later from the testimony of house staff. Madame Marguerite retired to her chambers immediately. She locked the door. She dismissed servants who knocked offering food or assistance. At some point in the afternoon, the housemaid Marie noticed an unusual smell coming from under the door. Sweet, chemical, wrong. When they finally broke down the door at sunset, they found Madame Marguerite lying on her bed, perfectly composed, her hands folded across her chest. She was dead. The room showed no signs of struggle. But every mirror in the room had been shattered, every single one, broken from the inside, as if something had struck them from within the glass itself. On the nightstand sat a teacup, still half full of liquid. The estate doctor, when he finally arrived, examined the tea and found it mixed with concentrated extracts from Madame Marguerite's own garden. Foxglove, monkshood, hemlock. Enough poison to kill 3 people. The official record entered into the Charleston death register on March 23, 1839, recorded simply, Marguerite Duchamp, aged 60 years, died of apoplexy at her residence. No suspicious circumstances noted. But the unofficial accounts, the ones whispered between neighbors and recorded in private letters, told a different story. Madame Marguerite had killed herself rather than face the humiliation of what had occurred. Rather than live with the knowledge that her absolute authority had been shattered by someone she'd considered beneath humanity. The plantation itself was burned to the ground within 6 weeks. The official story claimed an accident, but the enslaved people knew better. The fire had been set deliberately, started in multiple locations, by people who'd lived under Madame Marguerite's cruelty and saw the destruction of her legacy as justice. The fate of Céline after she walked off Bel Ombre remains a mystery wrapped in fragments and whispers. No runaway notices matching her description appear in any South Carolina newspaper from the period. No parish records document her capture or return. She simply vanished from official documentation, leaving only the accounts of what she'd survived and the impossibility of what she'd accomplished. 3 letters, now housed in the Charleston Historical Society, provide the only substantive documentation. All 3 were written by neighboring planters to relatives, all dated within 2 weeks of the incident, and all describe essentially the same scene. A young woman walking north along the coastal road, accompanied by 7 large dogs, refusing all offers of assistance or challenge, moving with a purpose that made even armed men reluctant to interfere. 1 letter, from a planter named Robert Middleton to his brother in Virginia, describes encountering Celine at a crossroads. She appeared as one who had passed through fire and emerged transformed. The dogs about her moved with military precision, and her bearing carried an authority I have seen in generals, but never in one of her station. I inquired if she required assistance. She fixed me with a look that made me regret the question and replied simply, "I am exactly where I need to be." The dogs positioned themselves between us, and I found myself stepping aside to let them pass. I watched until they disappeared toward the north, and I confess, I felt relief to see them go. The dogs themselves provide an additional mystery. 7 valuable animals, each worth substantial money, simply disappeared. No bills of sale, no transfer of ownership, no advertisements seeking their return. They left with Celine and vanished into history. The story of what happened didn't disappear entirely. It survived in the oral traditions of the enslaved community, passing from generation to generation as both historical account and parable. Elderly, formerly enslaved people interviewed in the 1,930 seconds occasionally referenced the woman and the dog story, though details varied and locations shifted depending on who was telling it. But the core remained consistent. Someone who'd been reduced to property, who was supposed to be broken, who survived something intended to kill her and emerged with power her oppressor could never understand. What do you think really happened in that cellar during those 8 days? Was it simply survival instinct? Was it some capacity for empathy and connection that transcends species? Could Celine have understood something about power that Madame Marguerite, for all her education and privilege, never grasped? The answer might be simpler and more profound than we imagine. Celine understood what Madame Marguerite never could, that all living things recognize the difference between someone who sees them as weapons and someone who sees them as fellow survivors. That solidarity formed in shared suffering can be stronger than conditioning built on fear. That the will to remain whole, to refuse to be broken, can accomplish what seems impossible. If you made it to the end of this account, you've journeyed through one of the most disturbing incidents in American history. A story that was deliberately suppressed but never entirely erased. Subscribe for more forgotten histories that challenge our understanding of the past. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another story that refuses to disappear. Share this with anyone who appreciates history's darkest and most inexplicable corners. And most importantly, keep questioning, keep digging, keep refusing to accept the sanitized versions of the past. Because somewhere in South Carolina in 1839, a young woman walked away from slavery with 7 dogs following her, and no one in authority could bring themselves to stop her. That impossible moment, that crack in the foundation of an entire system of oppression, matters more than any official record that tried to erase it.